Go ahead.
As we're waiting for the rest of the sports world to come back at some point, and I think there's so much uncertainty, it is nice to have the NFL draft, and I think specifically for the Ravens, coming off of a 14-2 season, and it was weird over the weekend. I was thinking that it had been 3 months exactly since the loss to the Titans, in mid-January, and where we are right now, not just thinking about in that context, but the entire world, how much it's changed. It'll be nice to talk a little bit of football, and I think for the Ravens specifically, look, I don't know what the season's going to look like, if there's going to be a season. I don't think anyone really knows that right now, but they're building a football team, and Eric DeCosta is going to pick football players, and they have quite a few picks in the top 150. When you look at this draft and the depth of this draft, the Ravens have a fantastic opportunity to make themselves better. And I'll continue to remind everyone, they're pretty darn good last year.
Better than 14-2, really?
I mean, hey, we can always talk about record and compared to what a team actually is. And look, I don't know if they're going to go 14-2 again. I'd bet against that just because that's how this typically goes. But that doesn't mean that they still can't be a Super Bowl team. It doesn't mean they can't be the team that's going to win it all. They might go 12-4, and you'd say, well, okay, well, that's 2 games worse. Well, if they win the Super Bowl, then I think you take it. So, but I think it's very clear as we've gotten through most of any meaningful free agent activity. That's not to say they won't make another move or two at some point. They have roughly $10 to $11 million in cap space. They're kind of hovering right around there. But they need their rookie pool. They need their rainy day fund for the regular season. So they don't have a lot of cap space to exhaust right now unless they want to redo some deals. So I think most attention is now on the draft. And I think,
so they're not signing Antonio Brown, you sure?
Eric DeCosta, I think that was a tough – I mean, the question needed to be asked because, hey, your MVP quarterback and your top wide receiver were working out with them. So, how do you not ask it in some way? But I think it was a tough question for him to answer from the standpoint of, this is Marquise Brown's cousin. It's a family member of his. So I don't know if you could be quite as blunt as, say, Bruce Arians was, speaking, as the Tampa Bay head coach, saying, we're not going to go down that road with Antonio Brown.
So you can't say something like, that MFer's crazy, and we bring him around
exactly.
here. What are you, nuts?
Especially when you're talking about the fact that one of your young, up-and-coming, potentially star players is related to him. I think you got to be careful there. But I think Eric DeCosta, without saying anything, said plenty there. And we know Steve Bisciotti's talked about this on numerous occasions since the Ray Rice fiasco, that the Ravens they're not going to go there with any player that is caught up in any kind of domestic abuse, anything of that nature. So, I think with that put aside now, I think you do look at the draft and inside linebacker. The Ravens still need to replace Marshall Yanda, or at least have someone that you feel pretty decent about lining up there at right guard. You're never going to replace Yanda, but you have those spots. You have edge rusher, wide receiver. They have some very clear needs / at the very least, positions they really, really want to address. I think you certainly look at inside linebacker now and say, okay, L.J. Fort and, Chris Board, really? There's no way. They're going to have to add, whether it ends up being Kenneth Murray or Patrick Queen in the first round, whether it ends up being some guys a little bit later on, like Jordan Brooks, or go down the list, Akeem Davis-Gaither from App State. There are guys that they can add to that spot, but they clearly need some inside linebacker help. They clearly want to add another wide receiver. Again, whether that's the first round, whether that's any number of guys. Eric DeCosta and other draft pundits have talked about there being a legit 20 to 25 draftable wide receivers, and a number of those guys even available day 2 and day 3 who could be starters. So, the talent is there for the positions they need to address or they want to address. But as you know, Nestor, it's a matter of how does the draft board fall? How do you maximize your value? I know DeCosta on Thursday was asked about trading up, and he kind of said and echoed what a lot of people in the football analytics community talk about now, that you can be as prepared and have your due diligence and go through and you evaluate the tape and you use the metrics and you got the combine numbers and you do all these studies. As we see more and more studies about the draft, guess what we find out? It's more random and more about luck than any of us would like to admit. That's just the truth. Even if the Ravens have had their pockets of time, they've had their periods of time where they've been excellent with the draft. But then you look at post Super Bowl 47, where they had about 4 years in a row of really kind of average, run-of-the-mill, mediocre, just like everyone else kind of drafts. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. So when you have that and you understand that, you might be a little less inclined to trade up unless you feel you're getting a star player that's fallen down the board. But you're not going to just be desperate to trade up just to fill a certain need. When you have as many picks as the Ravens do, 7 in the top 150, this is a golden opportunity for this team, not just to improve for 2020, but to put themselves in a position where we know what's coming, right? Lamar Jackson is going to get paid. Ronnie Stanley is probably going to become the highest paid left tackle in the NFL. Marlon Humphrey is going to become one of the highest, if not the highest paid corner in the NFL over the next.
They better win a championship along this road, right? I mean,
sure.
You start bringing up the Ray Lewises and the Ed Reeds, because I remember when those guys were all like getting paid, top of class. Ed Reed wanted cornerback money. I mean, all of that's going to come back again, right? I mean, Billick, you'd always say, right? There's, in season it's we, out of season it's me, right?
Sure.
And those off seasons are coming down the line, and that's all the more reason when you're 14-2 and you are in that area, you got to win. You got to win.
Agreed. But I'll also say, if you want to prolong that window and still be in a position that even after paying your quarterback that you can still be a championship caliber team, how are you going to do it? Through the draft. If the Ravens, and look, I'm not opposed to a trade-up under the perfect scenario. Someone that they really covet. I mean, Eric DeCosta used the example of Chase Young. Chase Young's not fallen out of probably the top 2, let alone falling to a place where the Ravens could conceivably trade up for him. But if you're going to just look at the collection of picks they have, 7 picks in the top 150, DeCosta's talked about there being at least that many draftable players. Actually more than that, which the number is not something that they're going to lie about. Specific players they'll lie about this time of year. But when you look at the number of draftable players that they have on their board, when you look at the number of picks they have, boy, this is a great opportunity, not just for 2020, but if you can have the kind of draft like the Ravens had 2 years ago, when you look at what they did with Andrews, with getting Orlando Brown, with Hayden Hurst didn't work out in the way they thought, but they were still able to flip him for a second-round pick 2 years later, which is still excellent value. So, it's hard to say, you wouldn't say he was a bust. It's just that Mark Andrews ended up being an unbelievable third-round pick.
It is kind of incredible the way they dealt him off, right? Like, I know we talked about it a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but when you start to get your mind around what the team is going to be. And look, next Thursday, one of the weird parts of this, and Luke, and we'll meander on. By the way, it's good to be talking a little bit of sports with you. But as I think about next Thursday night, I think about the draft and the bombast and the let's go to the military guy and the little girl and let's bring Mo Gabba in and let's welcome Ed Mulatalo back to make the pick. Or here's McCrary, Mayor John Ogden making a pick. And here's Vegas. And let's go down onto the Strip. And all of that, I was watching Mel Kiper and Todd McShay yell at each other in delay and try to keep a straight face over the weekend, and there's just something about this that's going to be lost a little bit in the bombast of the NFL, and it will be just a meat and potatoes kind of thing here, right? As we break players down, they'll have film, they'll be cutting stuff up and whatnot, but it's going to be really weird, right? All of it's going to be weird.
Well, it's just like every other aspect of our lives. I mean, everything's really weird right now. And look, there's 2 ways of looking to it. And believe me, this isn't me saying that anyone should be happy about any of this. I mean, life's really tough right now, and that's speaking as someone who isn't dealing with nearly the kind of hardships that other people are dealing with right now with with the reality of our lives right now and being in this stay-at-home kind of phase. And but that said, if we're able to acknowledge that, yeah, it's not the normal NFL draft, to your point, there's still some joy to take out of it. There's still fun to take out of it. I've talked to you a little bit about WWE. I've been very conflicted about whether they should, how they're doing it, whether they should be doing it, how they're getting away with it, all those different questions that anyone could ask about something that isn't a sport per se, but is still within that kind of realm that's dependent on people being around one another. But even though it's different without fans, there's still some joy and entertainment I've taken out of it, and I think the draft will be the same way. I think whenever we do have sports come back to varying degrees, whether we're talking about a sport like golf that can be much more isolated without a gallery, without
maybe tennis,
people,
right?
Tennis, NASCAR, or whether we're talking about if Major League Baseball can get to the point where the KBO is in South Korea is trying to be right now, and I'm not saying that's going to be next week. A couple months from now, maybe. I mean, it's been a month since sports have shut down. It feels like it's been 6 months. So that's just gives you a context of how much things can change in a matter of a handful of weeks. But I think with all of this, it's an adjustment. It's an acknowledgement that nothing's going to be, quote, normal anytime soon. I mean, even when we get to the point where things start to open back up in terms of some quote non-essential businesses, to use that term, not my term, but term that people, because it's very essential to a lot of people. But even when we start opening things back up in that way, and I fully expect that to be a very gradual process. It's not going to look the same, but at the same time, we can embrace aspects of this that are going to be realistic. And with the NFL draft, there's part of me that's actually intrigued to see Roger Goodell's basement, where he's going to be announcing picks. I mean,
I'm sure it's very, very humble.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, it's weird. It's weird, and so much of this stinks. It really does. But at the same time, we can kind of view it through the lens of it's all terrible, and we shouldn't be having the draft, and there's other more important things out there. And guess what? I'm not going to argue with someone who has that viewpoint necessarily. At the same time, it's nice to be able to sit here and talk about some football players and guys that are going to be Ravens, whether it's in September, whether it's October, whether it's next year. I don't know. But they're going to be Ravens at some point. And we will have these things again at some point in time. I hope it's sooner rather than later, but I'm also realistic enough to know that might not be possible. But to have for 3 nights, to talk about those players, and then we'll get to day 3, and it's the 6th round, and you're lucky if you've heard of a couple guys that come off the board at that point in time. It'll be fun. And I think one of my takeaways from last week with the pre-draft conference call was hopefully they're beefing up Eric DeCosta's internet connection a little bit, because I know it cut out a couple points.
Dude, I was going to text him in the middle of it and say, you know what, bro? Tell the kids to stop downloading movies downstairs, because I'm sure that's what's going on.
Yeah. I mean,
I was going to text Lacey and say, tell the kids to put down the games for a little while. You know?
There's no doubt. I mean, I brought that up in joking, but I think it is going to be very interesting to see how teams handle that. And I'm not saying that in terms of it, guys complaining to the league, or you've seen some of the reports about some NFL team officials wanting to push the draft back. I'm not talking in that context, but you think about a team like the Ravens, and you know this better than anyone, Nestor. They've always had a chain of command in the sense that Steve Bisciotti at the top, and Ozzie Newsome, and now Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh. But they've always made their decisions by scrimmaging, by debating, by trying to come up with consensus as much as they can. They have that, but when you have the kind of forum that they're going to have for the draft with Zoom, and understanding that it's technology dependent. It's remote. It's a remote process.
Something's going to go wrong. There's no doubt about it.
You do wonder if it's going to be a case where Eric DaCosta is going to have a much more firm grip on the steering wheel than normal. And I don't mean that as a criticism to him under normal circumstances. It's just normally there's much more of a widespread discussion going on. And ultimately, it's his call. He's the general manager, but it might be he's running a little more of a definitive, assertive point guard rather than kind of being the guy that is still ultimately making the call, but allowing the discussion to play out a little bit more, because it's going to be a timing thing as much as anything else. I mean, I think what's going to we can talk about scenarios where phones go out or internet goes down, and I'm not saying there won't be something like that at some point for some team over the course of 3 days. But I think what's much more interesting is a team like the Ravens. What do they love to do on draft day? They love to trade picks, whether they're trading back, whether they're moving up. What's that process going to look like? I mean, we can all remember Byron Leftwich in 2003, and the phones, and it happened again in 2011, the year the Ravens drafted Jimmy Smith. I mean, that happens anyway. But now, if you're talking about a case where, I would not be surprised if you have general managers, even if they no longer have a landline, have figured out something to kind of have foolproof phones. But how's that going to play out as far as trades and agreeing to a trade, but also
you also can't yell down the desk, get Cleveland on the phone, right? Exactly.
Yeah, I mean it's very different. So I think what's going to be fascinating, not that we're necessarily going to get any kind of a feel for this until after the fact, but I guarantee you over the next week to 10 days, as we're counting down to the final days before the draft, next Thursday night, is you're going to see simulations of how these teams are going to do this and what the timing is for if you do have a trade worked out with another team, how much time do you need to call it into the league and have this all go through? And you have to be mindful of that anyway, even when you're at your team facility, but it is different now because, to your point, you can't yell down the hall, or you don't have 20 people in the same room talking about, Pittsburgh offered us this, or Seattle's offered us this. Should we move back and pick up the extra day, round 4 pick? I mean, you're going to have some of that, but it's going to be remote, and it's probably going to have to be streamlined a little bit more. I'm guessing people that typically have a voice in the Ravens' war room or any team's war room are not going to have that voice, because you can't have, having 40 people on a Zoom chat is a recipe for disaster, relative to that draft process. I think it's the case where it's going to be fewer voices and more people being observers than they're used to being. So it'll be interesting. And, I think it'll be fine. I don't think it's I know John Harbaugh talked about the security concerns, and he's not alone in that. I mean, there's 32 GMs, coaches, executives, owners. I mean, there's going to be so much paranoia when you add in the remote technical aspect to this. But it'll be fine at the end of the day, and it'll be fun. And the Ravens will have some new football players, and we'll get a better idea of what the roster for 2020 is going to look like. And then, once the smoke clears from that, we'll get back to wondering if there will be a 2020 season and what it looks like. So it'll be fun, though. And again, at the very least, the Ravens can be adding some football players that will be suiting up for them at some point in time, even if we're not exactly sure when and how it's going to look.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, out on Twitter doing all things sports when there are sports. We're in pandemic programming around here. Lots of arts this week. Lots of great conversations with Baltimore business owners about how we are going to hold this thing together. Up in the buyatoyota.com audio vault, we will be doing more football next week in advance of the draft and then, of course, after the draft. But in the meantime, we're keeping calm. We're staying local. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive.